In this episode of the Smart Community Podcast, I have a really interesting chat with Anuraj Gambhir, an innovation evangelist, business strategist, and a philosopher as well. Anuraj tells us in this episode about his really varied career trajectory, starting from the communications industry and mobile technology industries through to startups and entrepreneurship, and now how he is involved in the holistic smart city space. Anuraj and I discussed the need for meaningful interaction with technology and the power of what he calls transdisciplinary, or the disruptive creativity that comes from integration across the different disciplines and industries. Anuraj also explains his focus on where technology and spirituality meets, and the importance of keeping humanity at the center of all tech. Anuraj tells us about a couple of the projects he has been involved in, with connecting the dots between industries and some of the real use cases of data and predictive analytics helping keeping humans safe and well. We finish our chat talking about the emerging trends of neurotech and wearable tech being used to improve health outcomes, plus the distributed intelligence in our smart regions and rural communities. As always, we hope you enjoy listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed making it.
Welcome to the smart community, smart regions, smart towns, and smart cities. It's where we live, work, and play. With smart communities, the future starts today. Big data, smart mobility, emerging trends galore. The Smart Community Podcast is what you're looking for.
Hello, Anuraj. How are you today?
Very well, Zoe. Thank you so much.
That's good to hear. Let's just jump straight in. And can you tell us about your background and what you're passionate about?
Sure. So I've started my career with doing engineering, really, electrical and electronics engineering at the University of New South Wales. And I got my first job at NASA, actually, working in Canberra at the Deep Space Tracking Station in Tidbinbilla, which was a great exposure into satellite communications. And I ended up doing quite a bit of work in that space. But I've oriented my initial roles in telecommunications in the mobile technology space. So was essentially involved with the mobile cellular area in the transition from analog to digital, which was from AMPS to GSM technology. And so I sort of grew my space in the GSM space, looking at building the roadmap, really being setting up various operators. So working with Optus here in the early days for about 5 years. And that moved after that to the US to help set up T-Mobile and AT&T, which was previously Bellsat Mobility and Pac-Bell in the West Coast. And I was then involved with setting up Orange in Switzerland, and then joined the GSM Association. So I spent about 10 odd years of my first part of my career working with the operator community. And then I moved on to working with the vendors in the telecom space. So I joined Sharp, which was Sharp Corporation out of Japan, to work in Europe. And really, we launched the first integrated camera phone outside of Japan, which was quite an exciting technology, and grew my space into the devices arena quite deeply, which is what I was working with the operators community on. So I'd worked with the GSM Association earlier. We were actually responsible for running this big event called the 3GSM World Congress, which was later renamed the Mobile World Congress, which we also had moved from Cannes in France to Barcelona in Spain as it grew so big. And in fact, currently, I've seen it grow from 75 people to 120,000 people plus. So it's an amazing big event as the biggest gathering of the mobile industry, with the whole ecosystem coming at play. And I think that was one of my early touch points also, to very much look at this whole smart city space as a whole. But from there, from Sharp, I'd moved on to Germany to head up innovation for Siemens mobile devices globally. And I think that's what I learned the most in my career, because I had a very large team with, R&D and marketing and deep technology know-how, which we built a lot of concepts. We incubated a lot of companies, did some amazing work from fashion phones right through to smart devices, right through to wearable tech. And from there, I'd moved on to actually looking at innovation more holistically, and was heading innovation for many other corporates. Moved to India and Africa, and then worked with the governments there to launch low-cost tablet in India called Akash, which was the world's cheapest tablet at that stage. But it was very much more about learnings from computer, one laptop per child, which we took into account, and the experience, and working as a holistic ecosystem again to build something which was more meaningful for a particular segment. And I was also working closely with another Skunkworks project, which was with a company called Nortel, And it was a project called Orbitor, which was actually IP of which was bought by Apple. And I was then working closely on the design of the very first iPhone on that regard, which was also very exciting, stage in my career. Then moved on really into working a lot more widely across many different industries, working with many startups, started teaching as adjunct faculty with many different academic institutes like INSEAD Business School, and really moved back to Australia only 5 years ago after an 18-year walkabout around the world, living and working in over 20 odd countries and so forth. So it's been a quite exciting ride being back here, where I've been involved with many incubators, accelerators with the startup ecosystem here, teaching entrepreneurship and consulting, and then doing a lot of other activities around the holistic sort of smart city space, as one could say.
Yeah, cool. And I think you've already answered this. It sounds like your whole career was in this space, but what sparked your interest in the smart city space?
So I would say, it's the general thinking and the broad picture, the big picture element is what I really enjoyed. And I say this term transdisciplinarity, which is really then thinking about connecting across industries and multiple disciplines. And I think that's the space when I, looked at innovation across so many different corporates of really bringing in stage left thinking and that aspect of disruptive, creativity, which was really bringing in that bigger picture thinking of what is it that a living entity would be looking like in terms of a system. And I would say that's what a smart city really is, because it's that whole space of driving, building insights to really create deeper foresights where one can look at touch points of what communities and more meaningful interactions will be enabled through exponential technologies.
Yeah, I think meaningful interactions, I really like that term, because we talk a lot about, obviously you come from this kind of tech background, but are you now working more in innovation and startups and that type of thing, and more like that, what can we do for people in that space?
Yeah, I've been following my passion back to something I was looking at through my whole journey. And I think that quest has gotten deeper right now, which is really looking at where technology and spirituality meet, actually. That's one of my big areas. And here I mean a more holistic well-being, where we're talking about work-life balance, we're talking about the happiness quotient, and an approach to physical, mental, and spiritual well-being as a whole. So it's really about uplifting us from the physical to the PQ to IQ to EQ, the emotional quotient, through to spiritual quotient, and right through to something we call the AQ, which is adaptability quotient, because that's what the fusion of technologies and the stage that the world is at right now, because the pace of change is accelerated so rapidly. And we're living in this time of just enormous impact on the verge of so many technologies that are really going to be creating some amazing benefits for mankind if taken in the right way. And that's a lot of the work I've been doing with Singularity University, which I've been very heavily involved with. In fact, I'm coming on board as global faculty. I've been a global mentor there with their startup program. And we've also got a big summit coming up actually next month right here in Sydney, which I'm a curation partner for. And I'm also doing a wearable tech, future tech fashion show there, which is also quite an exciting piece where I'm looking at health and wellness and learning and education and many different facets where technology and it's very broadly around where IoT and many touch points for a smart city and the constituents of what it should be are going to be showcased through our tech hub and so forth over there. But I'd say maybe your point, we were asking about the sparks of what got me interested in this. I'll probably, if I look back in a few touch points of my career, and one of them was when I worked with Siemens, every year I used to go to Eindhoven. Philips was one of our biggest suppliers, actually, Philips Semiconductor. And we had an event there called the Corporate Research Event, where they used to showcase technologies way ahead of time. And we would look at deeper use cases of how we could apply them and so forth. And we actually had a very concept-oriented smart home there, where we would experiment with many different aspects of how the media space is evolving, how we could look at smart connectivity through the cell phone and sensors evolution, basically looking at energy, lighting, media, and that seamless connectivity as a whole. That was a very interesting area which I really enjoyed working in. And I saw that sort of come back when I worked with the GSMA, when we moved the Mobile World Congress to Barcelona. And because Barcelona was dubbed later as the Mobile World Capital by GSMA. And we had several organizations, including the big telcos and the operators, the stakeholders from vendors also very much, like Siemens and Ericsson and so forth, showcase great technologies at that smart living sort of space in the Barcelona Mobile Show. And there were many other touch points which were then implemented as an experiment in that area. So that was a very interesting touch point also, where I sort of saw and learned that, yeah, the space of evolution of smart cities is growing very rapidly. And there was one other one I just recall, is when I was involved with doing a workshop in India, actually, with the global team of BP Castrol. So for an oil company to think, and really we did like a 3-day deep dive, and there were a few of us industry experts and visionaries brought together to come up with what would an oil company look like in 10 years and 20 years time. So it was much beyond oil, obviously. And the title of that workshop was The Future of Intelligent Mobility. So it was very much around transportation and that whole space. But we came up with some amazing disruptive ideas and built a lot of foresight around relevant spaces of what transportation from a shared perspective, right through to things we're talking about right now with Uber Air and many other autonomous and electric, and this whole space of new use cases and what people will be doing with their time in an autonomous vehicle, for example, in terms of productivity impact and those sort of areas. So that all has been a very exciting space and touch points that got me so excited that I feel I've really enjoyed working in that broader space, but then taking a deep dive in certain domains and saying where I've had a bit of experience or learning more of, which is kind of healthcare and health and well-being, and say transportation, and then also then education and learning. It's probably the 3 bigger domains that I've had more exposure in.
Yeah, cool. I'm really keen to hear your thoughts. Like, obviously your background, your career, and I've been kind of in the same place, but you've done so many different things and kind of moved around and that type of thing. And now at the university, Singularity University, how do you think like the future of work will be different in this space based on, you've obviously done a lot of work looking at the future. How do you think the future of work will change in this space? And based on your like career and trajectory, which I guess isn't very typical, but maybe that's kind of what the future of work will look like more and more. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, it's a very good point, because that's kind of what I map onto, and I see that the learnings I've had in my own life, with I'd say the learnings from failures also, which I've seen a few of, obviously. There's many products that I've been involved with launching, which obviously bombed in the market, but many that inspired and triggered. So I think it's many of these traits that I've been teaching, obviously, in many of the entrepreneurship courses and touch points, because actually in true sense, you really can't teach entrepreneurship, but it's more that you can enable the right traits and then you can trigger many different facets of it. And I think that's what future of work is very much around, being that generalist, growing that space of moving from that old VUCA, or the current VUCA as most people see, which is volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous world that we live in, to a new VUCA, which is what I call vision, understanding, clarity and agility. And I think we've seen many glimpses of this with the 4th Industrial Revolution and the skills that are needed, and even the World Economic Forum talking about creativity, critical thinking, creative intelligence really has moved so much high up the ladder as the needs of key traits that we need for the future of work. But I talk about it really in terms of the creative intelligence dogma, because it's evolved from the old dogma of, say, what needs to wants, from empathy to meaning, from story to narrative, from what we had earlier called general brainstorming to connecting the dots. And I think that's a very key one, because that's what it's going to take, working across so many industries, looking at what are the relevant exponential technologies we can apply to influence and to really bring exponential impact from the intersection of these technologies in different domains. So I would say, we're really seeing that aspects of the 21st century skills, which are obviously about, evolving us into a more holistic well-being state, where empathy, curiosity, the things we talk about in innovation very much, in creativity, are so essential. We talk about B2B, obviously, and B2C in a very business world. I talk about it as H to H, because I think it's coming back to that space of heart to heart or human to human. So I think humanity is back at the center of everything again, which is that realization that the technology enabled world is giving us right now, because there is so much clutter around us. It's really about how do we declutter from the digital elements which are not so important, and then find deeper meaning of, even in what I talk about as actually a Japanese philosophy of ikigai, the reason for being, right? Which is really at the intersection of what you love to do, what the world needs, what you can be paid for, and what you're good at. So it's really at that point of, if you follow your passion, if you have the right mission, you have the right profession and right vocation, it all sort of convolutes right down to then what's meaningful in your own life. And I think that's the journey most of the millennials and the next wave of work is going to be about, and people to realize that, okay, it's not about a 9 to 5 job. It's not about just working for a particular corporate or something like that. It's about adding value at a much broader sense and ultimately to your own life in that regard, which will then actually help the community a lot deeper as a whole.
No, that's awesome. Thanks so much for sharing that. I'm keen to pick up on your thoughts about, millennials. I'm a millennial, and, we talk about millennials doing things differently. It really sounds though like in your career that we're embracing this the whole time, or is it something that you learned along the way? And were you kind of an anomaly, or, were there other people that you met doing like similar things to what you were doing? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, good question. I think just one thing led to another. It's just the path that got woven, because most of the jobs that I actually worked in were never there, but they were never even advertised. They were just created because in the roles of innovation, and then also I've had titles, funny titles like Chief Dreamer for a company, and I sit on a few boards. So there's a lot of interesting sort of touch points I've had with many different organizations, from startups, scale-ups, corporates, and SMEs and so forth. But it's really saying that, okay, where can you add more value? And I think the journey that I've had as, say, Chief Innovation Officer, or looking at strategy and all for the bigger corporates, then moving on to harnessing that into what is more meaningful for uplifting my own learning, lifelong learning in that regard. I think it's just a path that got paved along the way that I didn't realize, and I think I've enjoyed every moment of it. Obviously, there have been many ups and downs. So there are times when obviously I get carried away doing too many freebies, which is people talk a lot about here. But I think it's something still you find, because currently I'm doing various things, like I'm doing an honorary EIR role at WeWork Labs. But it's the touch points and it's the learnings you gain from working with such a diverse range of startups, which has been such an uplifting experience. Because what I really enjoy is connecting the dots, and we're looking at a startup in one space and connecting the dots with another. So I'll give you maybe an example of one or a couple of them, which I've seen in the smart city space, actually. So I tend to focus more on hardware startups. And I'll give you an example of a startup in the transportation space called GoFar. I don't know if you've heard of them.
Yeah, actually, I have.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So I've been trialing. I was one of the first users, actually, and experimented with their product and been looking at that space quite deeply. So essentially what they're doing is making any car a smarter car. So every car after June of 2006 has an OBD2 port, what we call as the onboard diagnostic port. So it's simple terms, it's just a USB port in a vehicle, and it connects to the ECU, the electronic computer unit, basically, in a vehicle. And we're able to measure very deep analytics from the car in terms of driver behavior, looking at the various analytics of the car in its performance. And you're able to get into prescriptive analytics. So before the car breaks down, for example, and look at connectivity through this dongle, which enables us to, really understand a much better picture of a snapshot of managing your vehicle, and being able to look at, those analytics in a deeper sense by gamifying it. And then what GoFar is enabling is people to become better drivers also. So there are multiple applications and use cases there. But the one I wanted to talk about is when we looked at a more disruptive approach of connecting another industry. So this being transportation, and imagine if we're able to measure fatigue or stress. So I do a lot of work on neurotech, which is in the brain-computer interface space. I've got many startups globally that I've been involved with. And so one of them is called SmartCap, and the product called Life. And we've got a simple 4-channel EEG band that goes as part of the SmartCap that people could be wearing. So imagine in the truckies and the enterprise solution transportation area, where you're able to measure the stress and the fatigue of the drivers, and you could take them off the road. You could even disable the vehicle remotely by a very simple score that comes up in the dashboard, which is monitored remotely. And that's a very clear example of bringing these two worlds together. And I've seen a lot of this happen because that's where we see tremendous value generated when you're looking at two different aspects of ecosystems and industries. Another one is actually What Cost, maybe another one you've heard of. It's one of our early hardware startups. We had at Fish Burners here in Sydney. And our punchline there is intelligent living. So essentially what that does is they're in the energy space. So they get an energy footprint. And after a little bit of AI machine learning, maybe a week or so, we were able to get a detailed fingerprint for each appliance. So You're able to see when the washing machine was turned on. Then you're able to do analytics and being able to guide the user to when to turn on the machine, for example, and optimize various different scenarios of your home energy usage. But then imagine, so looking at home aged care living, if grandma didn't turn on the kettle and I'm able to get a trigger, and that's the type of use case that's being triggered, that's been enabled by what cost? Because it's all about the data and the analytics, and very much then through deep learning, we're able to get to a point where you can do, very quick predictive areas. I mean, these are very crude, simple examples, but we're seeing so much evolve and so rapidly in the IoT space with sensors and smart sensors and what we call fog analytics and edge analytics, which is even small data being of great value in the computing space of that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, really interesting examples. And I think it's that next level conversation then of like the balancing out, the human aspect of, what that predictive analytics actually does for the human to decide on what to do with that information. And I think that's a really interesting space as well. And potentially can save lives, right? Like that's at the end of the day, but then.
Totally, exactly. And that's why the human touch is so important. I think it's about what are the pain points? How can we look at cross-industry collaboration across this whole space? So one of the terms I'd actually coined was collaboration, which is open collaborative innovation. And in fact, over 3 decades, I had 3 terms I had coined. The first one, I think, is probably the strongest one, which I talk a lot about, and it's called simplicity. So it's the need for simplicity in an increasingly complex world or architecture or ecosystem. And I think we obviously we've seen so much complexity built all around us. It's all about presenting the simplicity in the front end and hiding the complexity, the technology basically in the back end. Because it's really not about technology, it's about the benefits, it's about the impact that it creates. And I think it's about less is more. And many of those areas, so it's a very universal sort of term and thing that I refer to across the board basically. And it's something which I first came up with when we were designing really the iPhone aspects of it, and even the Orbitor back then, which was really about the simplicity of a mobile device. Because I think in the early days, we went through so many iterations of usability, and that's something I used to call the grandmother test. So I said, if my grandmother can use that in the number of clicks to sending a message, or back then even sending like an MMS and all that, it was time to obviously productivity and gain, because a lot of times people didn't use a lot of the features in the devices. They were so complex. It was the 80-20 rule. 80% of the people used only 20% of the functionality of the device. And it's still kind of true in many regards.
Absolutely. I think we'll move on, because we talked a lot about what smart city is and why it's important. And even I'm keen to hear your answer on this. How do you think we can better integrate across the different disciplines, governments, communities, and industries?
Right. So I think it's about how can we work in harmony? I mean, I think it's about understanding that approach of what a smart city is really as a living organism, and the fact that everything is so interrelated, that it has to be the ecosystem and the different players working together to create value. It cannot be done by any single individual. In fact, that's what I say. Even for any corporates creating an innovation or a breakthrough product, even a Google or a Amazon, they cannot create anything alone. It has to be done collaboratively and with the right ecosystem. It's about not just about creating; it's about curating those ecosystems. So I think it's how do you get the optimal mix of the right people from the government, from say academia or R&D or industry, and the right corporates who synergize well with that topic, and then having them to build a kind of a champion network within that to really drive those key agendas in solving some of the big challenges. And in fact, I've seen a lot of that happen with the work at Singularity U, because that's where we're seeing, the world's biggest challenges or problems are actually the biggest opportunities. And how do we evolve people from that linear mindset, which is what humans are generally used to, but technology is moving at an exponential pace, exponential. And I think that's what it is really an exciting space, which I've been looking at and tinkering with maybe in the neurotech area also quite a bit, where we look at elements like digital twins. Also is another parallel, by the way, which is looking at virtual replicas of physical devices or elements. So you can actually do more thought experiments and being able to try out new things in a much more rapid. So it's about fast, obviously, rapid prototyping and failing fast in that regard to see what sort of works. And I think that's where startups come in extremely well. because startups, it's the time to market. It's how quickly they're able to sort of come up with more breakthrough and cleaner ideas, but they don't have the resources. But you need and that's why you need that collaborative approach with the large corporates who are able to provide that resource and that scale opportunity to new markets and to the bigger footprint. And then obviously the governments to be able to come up with the right models and the governance and the whole reach to the community. So I think it very much is a case by case basis in that regard of what are we really addressing there. But I think when I look at the big picture of topics that we've been looking at, we have something called the Global Impact Challenge, where we address the global grant challenges, which is mapped onto the Millennium Development Goals of the UN. And within that, sort of, if you look at that very big picture, you sort of see those domains of poverty, hunger, health, education, energy, infrastructure, inequalities, all the planet as a whole, space, each of those big domains, and sort of you phase them down and you look at what needs to be curated under each one to be able to solve some of these grand challenges that we have. And what so it's about local thinking, as I call it. So thinking global, but acting local. And that's what the governments would really be able to help enable with the right ecosystem. But I think, it's kind of hard to say that or come up with a generic solution. It just has to be specific. And I think what we currently, I think what's making news, as you know, is the climate change. And there's a big things happening. My colleague is actually at the big UN Assembly right now in New York, where in fact the Prime Minister is also headed, SCOMO, who's talking about a lot of, and as you know, on Friday there was a lot of protests and the kids obviously talking about their future. I think this is a very key domain for future of smart cities, where we need to look at the sustainability and that community approach, which is being raised as a very key issue. But there are many topics and many startups which are coming, which have great ideas on clean air, clean water, on topics and especially with IoT and solutions where we can monitor and then look at, health, for example, as a very key upliftment within that. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I often say smart cities is just sexy sustainability, or that's what it should be treated as, because and in all sense of the word, people, profit, and planet, and then how we actually bring the right people together to be able to do that.
Exactly.
Okay. What are the emerging trends that people aren't talking about enough?
Right. Well, I think there are obviously key mega trends out there, which we tend to all hear about, and we know some of those big challenges and things. But I think it's in the technology space where we tend to see there are so many new developments that are happening. And it's obviously when we talk about that the future is very unevenly shaped in that way, it's very much in how deep tech is maturing. And I think there are certain domains there. So, again, an example of the space that I've been looking at is neurotech in neuroscience, for example, where imagine one of the key areas of a smart city is really about quality of life and the gross happiness quotient, as one may call it even. How can you impact that? And it's so interlinked with each different facet of, be it transportation or energy, and each facet of touch points of life within a smart city. How can we uplift that, the sort of brain and the mindset of the person? And that's where we're seeing a lot of research happening in technologies like what we call transcranial direct current stimulation. So it's like what is happening in terms of how we can basically measure brain waves using EEG. How can we also write to the brain? So we can look at disability tech. We can look at how do we manipulate people to become smarter and more creative. So there is actually a lot of research happening in this space, which is becoming more meaningful. There are some products at an early stage which are coming about in this area. And like I was telling you, that example of measuring fatigue and stress, which is happening through your brain waves. Looking at sleep is one of the big areas in health that is actually regarded very closely to even creativity. So there's some really interesting interlinkages that are coming about. And those, I think, intersectives are enabling what is it that we need to focus more on with that regard. And we're also seeing obviously other work that I do in the wearable tech space. We're measuring your stress through heart rate variability. We can do, for example, I've got a device which is almost, you can say, from Star Trek, the tricorder, because it does blood pressure, blood glucose, body fat, body temperature, oxygen saturation, and heart rate variability all in one device. And it's a tiny device. And I've got a new version of that, which I just brought back from Silicon Valley from one of my companies I mentor there, called NeuroSky, called the Life Band, which is a smart watch, which all of these elements are democratized too. So I can do all of that in a right on my wrist actually, and it's giving me my heart health. It's giving me how my calmness level, so my anxiety level to that regard, and my overall stress levels. So all that is, I think, very interesting areas where we're seeing edge analytics and being able to say, okay, what do I need to do? So another company that I mentor called Relax VR. So imagine if you are stressed and you need to do a very quick kind of what I call a digital detox. You're able to put yourself in this virtual reality mode with the Relax VR, where we do a 5, 10, 15-minute kind of a meditation routine with beautiful multimedia and the right music, right the ambience, because VR is a great empathy tool. And when you're immersed in that sort of area, you're really experiencing, and that's actually another term that I'd coined, which is about very immersive, story showing, moving from passive storytelling to story showing. So you're able to sort of get into this new world, which takes you, and relieves that stress, obviously, and take you to a whole new dimension. So yeah, I mean, there are things like that, which are, and I would say the evolution even happening with the broader space of smart cities with IoT and IIoT. And I like the way Flextronics, this company, what they call IoT is intelligence of things. So I think all sensors, every aspect of that, of the ingredient of a smart city, it's the level of intelligence that it's sort of evolving to. And that's growing faster and faster.
Yeah, no, sounds really interesting. And I just also see so many challenges to overcome in that space as well. And really working out what it is as humans we need and what different people need. It will be really fascinating to see where that kind of ends up.
Yeah, exactly. And I think because, we tend to talk about smart cities only as urban environments and all, but I think there's so much, and especially in Australia, obviously the outback. And I say, why can't we talk about smart outback or rural upliftment? And I think where agri community, which is such a big area domain for Australia, and we have so much know-how in agri-tech, for example. So it's how do we think a much broader beyond for those remote and country and hinterland sort of scattered inhabitations, where we need to look at that whole community approach, because it's on that edge that we'll find that true connectivity and harmonization with what I think we stand for. And I think that applies to many other countries also around the world.
Yeah, I agree. And smart regions is a big passion of mine, and something that, it's a space I work in, and we need to focus on it more. And then, like you said, we've got such deep expertise out there, and then to be able to leverage that globally, so then we can bring in the economic development and all that type of stuff as well is really, really important, and a really important piece of the pie that sometimes we probably don't talk about enough.
Yeah. In fact, that was my own awakening when I left the world, as in worked in Europe for 10 years, and I moved to India and Africa. It was traveling to remote parts of those countries where obviously emerging markets, and then meeting innovators from the rural parts of the country, and discussing and co-creating sort of solutions with them. And they're very smart sort of in adapting, and something what we call jugaad innovation, which is really frugal innovation. Jugaad is a kind of an Indian term, so it's really talking about using the minimal amount of resources to create maximum value. And I think that term is very wide. Every country and every sort of region also has their own aspects and aspirations for that area of frugal innovation. But it's the learning that you gain from the travel that you have with these, and working with these communities, remote communities sometimes, and being able to look at those solutions that they come up with, and being able to sort of go through the right designing thinking steps so that they can be scaled up and brought to the bigger use. It's an amazing feat, I would say, that we can all learn from. And there is distributed intelligence all over, actually, which we need to tap much more stronger.
Well, it's been so great to chat with you, Anuraj. Thank you so much for coming onto the podcast.
No, thank you, Zoe. It's been a pleasure. I look forward to more interactions with you in the future.
Yeah, no, it sounds really good. We should definitely chat again, and I'll let you know when I'm down your way.
Certainly.
I just have one last question. And yeah, I'm really keen to talk to you more about smart regions. So let's definitely put that on the list.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, it's just more thoughts and things which I've been sort of propagating in that area, and saying, we just say smart cities so much. We need to be talking about smart environments, and just proliferate that much broader, because people just get narrowly focused on things which are relevant only to cities then.
Absolutely. I mean, that's why I changed the podcast to Smart Community Podcast.
Excellent. No, that's perfect.
Cool. I just have one last question, which is, how can people connect with you?
Sure. I mean, so through LinkedIn is probably where I'm probably the most active in or reasonably active on social media. The others I'm not so active, but yeah, that's probably the best one, or through email.
Easy. Well, we'll put the links in the show notes so people can click away and find you. Again, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast.
Pleasure. Thank you, Zoe.
Talk soon.
Cheers.
Bye. Thanks so much for listening to the Smart Community Podcast. Show notes for this episode and all other episodes are available on our website, mysmart.community. If you have any questions for us or any of our guests, you can email hello@mysmart.community or find us on the socials. We are on LinkedIn, Facebook and Twitter @SmartComPod. That's com with 2 M's. If you are enjoying the podcast, please leave us a rating and review at wherever you listen. This really helps us reach more ears, so thank you in advance. As always, I hope you enjoyed listening to this episode as much as I enjoyed making it.
The Smart Community Podcast is what you're looking for.